Welcome to Ministries That Podcast, where I talk to successful ministry leaders about how they're using podcasting to amplify their mission and grow their ministry so you can too. I'm Tim Hull, your host and owner of Sonomorphic, a podcast production company that specializes in podcasting for ministries. My guest today is Patrick Miller. He's a pastor and director of digital relationships at The Crossing, along with being a co-host of 10-Minute Bible Talks, Devotional Bible Study. Patrick and I are going to talk about the challenges that they had to overcome as they started their podcast, why they have 5 co-hosts on their show, and the decision to have an email newsletter in addition to the podcast. So let's jump right in. Here's my conversation with Patrick Miller. Well, Patrick, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so I first came across 10-Minute Bible Talks probably 6-8 months ago when I was starting my podcast. I was going through the charts trying to figure out, okay, who'd be some good guests to have on the show? I saw the album artwork for your show and the Bible Talks stands out and the orange background jumps out. And so I was like, I clicked in on it and saw that at the time there was like over 750 episodes. I was like, oh, wow. They've been doing this for some time, as well as then I saw that it was daily. And now you're at almost 1,000 episodes, I think just a few weeks away from hitting that.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to talk about your podcasting journey with this daily podcast. It's Monday through Friday. It's a devotional podcast. And so what I usually do at the beginning is scroll back all the way to the beginning of the feed, try to figure out, okay, what was going on at the beginning, and saw that you started the show back in August of 2019.
Yeah.
You and your co-host Keith were talking about starting the podcast and that you'd been wanting to do it for a really long time, but it proved to be more of a challenge than you expected. So I would love to start there. What were some of the challenges that you faced early on as you were contemplating starting a podcast?
Yeah. Well, hey, let me rewind. This is a podcast about podcasting.
Yeah.
Because you said something earlier and it made me feel like, oh man, that actually worked. When we were designing the cover for our podcast, what I told our designer was, hey, if you go look at Christian devotional podcasts, you'll notice that the color palette is largely cool color, so green and blue. And I said, what we have almost none of are either warm colors or hot colors. And so I said, just do with that as you will. And he came back with this logo that honestly, it kind of looks like it's Halloween all the time because it's orange and black. And when it is Halloween time, I wonder if people think we're playing a joke. But it worked because it really does stand out in the podcast feed from other podcasts around it. But the other big thing is what you said. Look, people aren't going to look at the actual title that's written out. They're going to look at the logo. And so I wanted to make sure the words on it were very legible to people. They could read 10-Minute Bible Talks very easily. It's black and white in that portion. And I also want to make sure that the title was very clear, that no one would have any question what they were getting when they read that title. What is this? Well, I guess it's 10 minutes long and they talk about the Bible. Bingo, that's exactly what it was. And this actually does kind of go back to the challenge that we had starting the podcast. Back in probably 2017, 2018, I was largely doing ministry to people in their 20s. And I knew that if I wanted to reach people in their 20s, I needed to go to their neighborhood, not their literal neighborhood, but where they spend their time. And of course, where plenty of them were spending their time was on their phones. And at that time, a lot of time on podcasts. And so I had the idea, well, let's reach them where they're at. Let's do Christian education via podcast and see where that goes. And so I actually worked on a different podcast idea, which at the time was called Bible Wise, WHYS, but you get the play on words, Bible Wise. And we did a bunch of test episodes. It was a little Bible Project-y podcast. Have you ever heard the Bible Project podcast? 2 people doing long-form discussion on the Bible. And the person I was doing it was fantastic. There was nothing wrong with her, nothing wrong with me, but I was very careful. After we recorded those episodes, I actually sent them out to some focus groups, people at our church that I trusted to give me good feedback. And the feedback was terrible. I mean, they told us, in the nicest way possible, you sound like you're mansplaining. This dynamic between you two isn't working. It's too long. It's too technical. And when I got that feedback, I had a choice to make. Was I going to listen and go back to the drawing board and figure out a format that would actually help people in our church, because apparently this didn't, or would I just run forward and do the thing that I wanted to do? And so obviously we decided, no, we're going to go ahead and set this one aside. And so we started all over again, and we came up with the idea of, well, look, 10-minute commutes are normal in our city. What if people could just listen to the Bible for 10 minutes and get a devotional? And maybe there's people, especially who don't normally normally read their Bible. They're not used to even doing devotionals. That was our target. We really wanted to help those kinds of people who were just getting started on their journey with Jesus figure out how to get in the Bible. And as it turns out, we have people all over the place on their journey with Jesus who were benefiting from the podcast. It wasn't just them, but that's where we started. But we did the exact same process again. We recorded test episodes. We sent them out to multiple groups. We got feedback on them. That caused us to, again, make some changes, some tweaks to what we were doing. And then we finally launched a podcast. And at our church right now, my team, I think we're running something like 6 or 7 different podcasts at this point. And that's just the process that we follow now, because that feedback from real life people is invaluable for one reason. If you're doing the podcast for yourself or your own glory, it is not worth doing. If you want to do it for God's glory, that is worth doing. And I think God is glorified when we help people. And so listening to people is the key to actually hitting the main goal, which is making his name great, not our name great.
Yeah, that's some great backstory. And not a whole lot of people go to that extent of like having focus groups and sending out, but that's great that you did that and got that feedback so that you knew to pivot on this to some extent and figure out, okay, what do people actually want? Because it's all too easy to be like, I really love this idea, let's just do it. And then you wonder why it doesn't work.
Well, and I'm sure there's plenty of pastors, ministry leaders listening to this, and I know what your life is like. Your time is highly limited. People want a lot of your time, and you want to give a lot of that time away. And so when you start talking about doing a podcast, it's going to add into your week an additional hour or 2 hours of work. You have to be really certain that that's the right use of your time, because you're the steward of your time. And so even once we started, we actually set some goals about downloads, like, hey, we need to get this many downloads. And we were focused just on our church. And we knew how big our church was. And so we had an idea of if our church was listening, we get about this many downloads in a year. And we said if we didn't get that, we were just going to shut it down, because there was going to be other places that God could probably use our time more effectively in ministry. As it turned out, I think we hit that goal in about 2 months. And since then, God has just blessed the podcast, and it's continued to reach more and more and more people in ways that we never expected. I mean, we were just trying to help our church. We had no idea that it would eventually, be helping people across the country, but that's been a fun thing. Amazing what God does, and we're grateful for it.
Yeah, that's really cool. So you were talking about this a little bit, but what were some of those pain points that as you were reaching out to people of, hey, do you like this? What were some of the pain points that they felt like this podcast was helping solve for them as you were getting that started?
I think understanding the pain point is key for your podcast. One of the things we've always said is, I'm not making a podcast for me, by which I mean I'm not making a podcast that I want to listen to. I'm a pastor, I'm a thinker, and so I like higher brow podcasts than what we're actually creating. And the temptation for pastors who tend to be readers, thinkers, they want to make those kinds of podcasts. And I don't know if it's about impressing yourself or impressing your family, or maybe it's not about impressing anyone, it's just what you like to talk about. I totally get it. It's what I like to talk about as well. But what we decided early on was that we wanted to help people who were maybe new to Christianity, to having been a part of Christianity for a few years, who had not yet developed a habit of reading the Bible regularly in their life. And one of the obstacles that they faced is they just didn't know how to do it. I mean, obviously they know how to read, but they didn't know how to understand the text and then apply the text to their life. And so that was the main goal, was a podcast that would go through books of the Bible. It would explain the text. So they would learn by listening to us. Oh, this is how I kind of understand what I'm reading. But then also very heavy on application. It would help them learn, how do I go from reading this passage in Leviticus 16 about, this slaughtered lamb on a Day of Atonement? Like, what in the world does that have to do with my life? Well, it turns out it has a huge amount to do with your life. And that's a particularly hard passage to apply to your life. I mean, the whole book of Leviticus. But we went through the book of Leviticus just to show people, no, God's word, no matter where it's found, can actually cut into your life and transform you. And so that's always been our niche audience. And like I said, the one thing I'll tell people is people get really worried when you're like, well, my podcast is for everyone. And I say, it could be for everyone, but it won't be for everyone unless you choose someone. And so once you focus in on that person and you aim for them over and over, and we have literal target personas, like we've created characters that we're thinking about in our heads when we're doing these podcasts. If you hit that person will not only share it with other people, you will just be surprised. It will hit so many more people. But the best way to miss everyone is to aim for everyone. We've just seen that principle be applied in so many different spaces. And 10-minute Bible talks now, I know we have lots of, again, new Christians. I mean, there are people who've been, converted by listening, or a part of their conversion stories listening to the podcast. Yeah. Then we have seasoned Christians who are in their 60s who've been reading their Bibles their whole lives, and they'll tell us how much they love it. And I love that. I'm like, we weren't aiming for you, but I'm so glad God is using this to help you and to encourage you.
Yeah, that's cool to see the impact. And yeah, having an audience in mind when you're creating the show is huge so that you are aiming somewhere
Yes.
so that you're not just being like, well, this is a cool idea and I think everybody can benefit from this, right? And maybe they can, but that should be a byproduct of reaching the people that you want to reach.
And I mean, that can feel a little bit, I don't know, naughty in Christian world because the truth is that the gospel is for
Sure.
everyone. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
sometimes people start feeling a little bit icky where they say, oh, well, by saying it, I'm aiming for this person, then, I'm saying the gospel. And it's like, no, 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 no. What you're saying is the gospel is for everyone, but everything we do isn't always for everyone. Instead, we should try to do as many different things as we can do to reach as many people as we can. People are all coming to Jesus in different ways, in different fashions, in different life stages. And it's beautiful that he has a body of people doing different things to reach those people. So if you're just the pinky, great, embrace it. Like do that pinky thing really well.
Well, you were mentioning a minute ago that you have multiple podcasts that come out of your church. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that, the idea to start basically a network of podcasts. How are they related to the church and how are they separate? What does that look like?
That's one of those things that developed slowly over time. So we started with 10-minute Bible talks, and then we just have fantastic people in our church. We have a fantastic team of people that, helps put together these podcasts. It is not just me. I'm just a little piece in a far bigger puzzle. But moving beyond that, we had people who weren't even employed by the church who just happened to be fantastic teachers and communicators. And when they heard 10-minute Bible talks, they came to us and said, well, we'd love to do something like that too. And rather than clamping down and saying, no, we're going to be the only ones at the podcast and we're going to control everything, we said, well, that's great. Let's figure out how to get you equipment. Let's figure out how to get you set up. And so we did that. And then we did it again. Then we did it again. Then we did it again. We kept repeating it over and over. And what's beautiful is the podcasts we have now are podcasts I would have never invented and that I cannot do. We have one podcast that's, two women in their kind of late 20s, early 30s, and they talk about stuff that women in that age group, young moms, love to talk about. Like I literally cannot do that podcast, try as I may. We have another podcast that's done by our counselors at the church. And so they're talking a lot about the heart and emotions and emotional intelligence. Again, I could add something to that conversation, but man, those counselors, they can have that conversation. And so part of it is just leaning into the different gifts that people inside our church had and then giving them the tools and the resources they needed to make it happen. One of my main goals was just to lower obstacles for people, make it as easy as possible for them to do the creative thing, and then figure out if, again, like I said, we have a fantastic team. If there's other people who are more administratively minded who could help manage some of the particular details that go into taking a podcast from saying an idea into a microphone to being an idea on an RSS feed.
Right. Yeah. Because there's a whole lot that goes on between there, and people are totally gifted in creating content, and other people are gifted in doing the production side of things. And so, yeah, having somebody that's able to come in and do the content piece, like you're saying, that only they can do, and being able to support them in that way is great. So that's really cool to hear. As I was looking into more of what you do with 10-minute Bible talks, I noticed that there's several co-hosts that you have. And with the format of it being daily, there's a lot of people involved, as we've been talking about. So I'd love to hear a little bit of how you developed the format to have. Currently now it's 5 co-hosts that are all involved in certain episodes. Did it start just as you and Keith and then just add from there?
Yeah. So when we started, it was Keith and I doing 2 episodes a week, so 2 10-minute devotionals. We would have loved to have done it on an everyday basis or, every weekday basis, but realistically, we didn't have the time. And again, at the time, we weren't sure whether or not it was worth our time.
Sure.
We very quickly realized it was, but we also realized that neither one of us had the bandwidth. And so we reached out to our first co-host. This was someone who was in our church, Tanya. She's a fantastic Bible teacher. She's outstanding. She leads a lot of women's Bible studies. And so we had her come on and do that. She's not paid by the church. She's a member of our church. And that went really well and people really liked it. So then we brought in another one. I thought, well, gosh, now we could have it 4 times a week. So we brought in Jensen. And then we said, we want to do 5 days a week. So each one of us picked up an extra one once a month. And then we all realized that's really hard. So we brought in a 5th host, Jeff, and that's kind of become the team of people that are on the podcast. And so it was really a function of, we believe that people being in the Bible as much as possible is a good thing. And that even just having it every weekday when people are commuting and that's kind of their listening structure, if we had one every day, we felt confident people were going to listen to it and that it was really going to help them. So that took, we brought Jeff on at the beginning of this year. So, that took 4 years, 5 years to get to the point where we actually had 5 co-hosts. But I will say this, we were very protective. we knew that the people listening to us expected a certain quality of teaching and communication, a certain set of values. I mean, obviously we're an evangelical church and we have theological distinctives that we care about. And so that becomes a very narrow Venn diagram, finding great communicators who have the time and availability and fit within those distinctives. But over time, those people, they came out of the woodworks, and I love it. I mean, and people tell us when they listen to it. I mean, everybody has a different favorite host, and I think that's great. I don't think I'm anyone's favorite host, but the other four, they're fantastic. And it's really cool because I think our listeners benefit from the diversity of voices that they're hearing. They don't get bored, because the reality is every pastor has 10 sermons. And so that probably means I've got 10 devotionals, And so if I do that, every single day for 2 weeks, I've already given all my stuff. But now, it takes a few months to get everything that I have, at least.
Yeah. It's a cool model to do it that way. And yeah, it totally then lends itself to being more sustainable by doing that. So I think that's a great choice to do that. Was there any other shows that you were modeling that off of? Or was it just like, I think this is what makes sense for us?
I can't think of any shows that have this model. I mean, there's plenty of shows that do the daily devotional thing, and my hat is off to those individuals who can do this every day. They probably have entire teams that are working just on one podcast to make that happen, and that's great. We have a team that works on all of our podcasts and all of our digital stuff as a church, so we have a lot more to do than just one podcast. But the other thing I'll say is this, and I'm not critiquing anyone with this. We didn't start this podcast because we wanted to be celebrities or well-known people. Another distinctive of our cover is there's no faces on it. It's not, the 10-minute Bible talk show with Patrick Miller. It's just 10-minute Bible talks. We're not trying to draw attention to ourselves. We're trying to draw attention to Jesus. And so interestingly, by diversifying the voices, I think it actually protects us against some of the temptations that come from being the sole voice. And again, there's nothing wrong. I love those podcasts that have one person, and I'm so impressed by them. So I'm not picking targets here and saying what they're doing is wrong. I'm just saying for us and our church context, that felt like a really natural fit with our values.
Yeah. So I've noticed as I was scrolling back through that you've been in Genesis, you've been in Revelation, and all over in between, but it's not going straight through the Bible. There's a curated way in which you're doing that. So how have you decided over the years what you're going to go through in a year and kind of how to curate it for the audience?
Yeah, so early on, it was just Keith and I, who both loved the Bible, sitting in our office deciding what did we want to teach next? What book of the Bible were we most interested in? Now, we were very conscious for a podcast like this that certain biblical books do better. It's easier, for example, to do a narrative on a podcast than it is to do the book of Leviticus. I say that from personal experience. And so early on, we were focused primarily on narrative books. So, we did Judges and Joshua and Luke and those kinds of books. And that was a great fit for us. As we started bringing on more co-hosts, we were able to go through the Bible faster. In the past, it could take us months to get through a single book of the Bible. And so at that point, we started thinking through, do we need to be a little more strategic about how we're doing this? And so 2.5 years ago, we made our first choice to do a big chunk of the Bible. We decided we wanted to do the whole Torah. So that's the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And we knew it was going to be hard. I mean, you've got law codes in there, you've got ceremonial codes in there, you've got some crazy passages that are morally tough to deal with in there. You have narratives too, but it's not the majority. And it went so well. It was hard. It was harder than what we'd done in the past. But what we heard back from our listeners was that they loved the sense of, I just got through a section of the Bible. For a lot of them, a section they've never read before. I mean, people love to do Bible in a year, and everybody stops by the time they hit Leviticus. And so, I think we helped people get over that hump because there was someone there to guide them through the passages that they were reading. And we're intentional too. We don't necessarily do one chapter per podcast. So, when we were in Leviticus, we took the various sections of law codes and did them all at once. And I think that was a helpful way for people to get through it, because it turns out those 7 chapters actually have a huge amount in common. And if you understand the commonalities, you're going to appreciate the individual chapters more. And then the year after that, we thought, wouldn't it be cool to go through the New Testament in a year? So that's what we did. And now we're running out of Bible. And so this year, we said we're going to do the writings. That comes from an old Jewish way of organizing the Bible. Yeah. It's a lot of different books. And so after this, all we'll have left will be the history books and the prophets. And so I suspect we'll be doing those in the next year, just to be able to say we got through the whole Bible. And then who knows, maybe someday we'll go crazy and try to do the whole Bible in a year. That feels like a lot, but we'll see.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was about to ask, was how much of the Bible have you gone through and what remains? So it sounds like it's not too far off for completing going through the whole Bible. What do you anticipate doing after that?
We'll start over. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
the beauty of God's word is there's always something new to find. And we have repeated books already. When we did the New Testament, we repeated First Corinthians and Luke and Mark and all these other books that we had already previously done in the podcast. But it was kind of fun to, for me at least, because there's a multiplicity of us, you're not actually doing every chapter. And so when you come back to it, you're going to pick up things that you haven't done in the past. And so even for the host, it's a different experience. I think for the listener,
Sure.
then they're going to hear something fresh, something new.
Yeah. And there's another podcast that you may have heard of that Annie F. Downs has done called Let's Read the Gospels. And she's read the Gospels, I can't remember how many times it is at this point. I think it's like 14 or more times. And I was just listening to an interview that she did about that show the other day and was talking about, every time, just like you're saying, every time you go through it, you're going to notice different things. In her case, she's also has gone through it in different translations. And so different things pop in different translations. So just start over, figure out what the next thing, how to go through it the next time. But just keep going and keep going. That's great.
Yeah, yeah.
So as you look back over the past 4 or 5 years that you've been doing the podcast at this point, how would you say that it's helped amplify your mission and grow your ministry?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wrote a whole blog post about this recently, actually. The name I've given this model, it's not a very exciting name, so no one get pumped up for this, is what I call the parish podcast model. And so here's my working theory here. Back in the 1800s, 1700s, it would have been most common for people to go to the church nearest to wherever they live. And that would have been your parish, right? And so parish pastors, part of their job was typically to walk around the town, visit people while they were working, visit people while they were at home, and build relationships with them, check in on them, see how they're doing. That was just a normal part of pastoral ministry. That's parish ministry in general. And the technology that changed that was not the iPhone, it was not the internet, it was not the television, it was the car. Because vehicles gave us the ability to all of a sudden live in wildly distant spaces from one another. It's what created the suburbs. You don't have suburbs before the widespread adoption of vehicles. And when you go to the suburbs, you're a long ways, miles away, probably from your grocery store, from wherever you buy clothes from, definitely wherever you work from, and quite likely your church. It's not uncommon for people to drive 10, 15, 20, 30 miles to go visit a church. Well, that church is no longer a parish. There's no way for that pastor to walk around the village or the neighborhood and see everybody there. And so cars dramatically changed how things work. Now, when you think about a car, the normal medium, or used to be the normative medium for a car, was a radio. And this is why Christian radio really developed. It became effectively the parish pastor for people who were commuting from here and there who wanted to get Christian content. Now, we come into the present, and radio is not actually on a super decline. Plenty of people still listen to radio, but there's a huge and growing number of people who listen to audiobooks and podcasts primarily while they're driving. And that's the place that I see podcasts existing in our ministry at our church. I can bemoan it, I can dislike it, but the simple reality is people who live in the suburbs, that's where our church is, are busier than they've ever been. They're sending their kids off to, weekend sports, and they have a hard time being at church just 3 times a month. And again, I don't think any of that's good. I'm just acknowledging the fact that it's a reality. And so getting them there on a Wednesday night to do a class, or a Sunday morning to do a class, it no longer feels, I think, as realistic as it used to feel. And so that's where our podcasts have stepped into the Christian education space. But why I use the parish models is it's not just information download. What I've discovered is that as a podcaster, people develop a relationship with you. Now, I know it's one-sided, but I cannot tell you how many times, it's happened 5 times this week. We're having our VBS, so a lot of people are seeing me, that someone will come up to me. And we're a big church. I don't know them. And they'll say, "Hey, Patrick, I'm so glad I saw you here." And I'm like, "This is awesome. Like, this person feels like a friend already." And they'll be like, "Oh, I listened to 10-minute Bible Talks. I listened to Truth Over Tribe. I feel like I know you so well." And I'm like, you, and I will always tell them, I go, "You do. Like, I know we've never talked before, but we have a relationship. And I'm so glad this has been benefiting. Tell me about you. Let me get to know you." And so even though I'm not physically walking through their neighborhood and alongside them, I am in their ears while they're jogging. I'm in their ears while they're driving. And I have a parish type relationship with them that I could not have apart from us all living in a small village alongside one another. And so that's always my press on pastors, is to say, you got to figure out what's the format, the thing that you can give your people that allows you to be in their life when it's not Sunday. Because chances are, if you don't do that, you're not going to have it. And I'm just not convinced that Sunday and Sunday and Sunday is going to change people's lives. They need Monday through Friday. We need to disciple people throughout the week. And I think podcasting is a real gift from God that we have the opportunity to do that and to connect with them. And I know people will say, well, there's other podcasts, they do things that are really well. And I just want pastors here, that is true. There's better communicators, better podcasters than you, but your people want to hear from you. You are the person who they see, who they recognize, who they know, who they have a relationship with. And podcasts give you the opportunity when you're not physically proximate to them to actually connect with them and be a part of their life. And I don't know why people don't take up the opportunity. It's been a huge part of our ministry.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And yeah, I was talking to a pastor in Nashville area, Darren Tyler, who, when I was chatting with him, he was like, yeah, the reason we do a podcast is because the Wednesday night service is dead. And so we're taking that opportunity, similar to what you're saying, and giving people an opportunity to spend time with me as a pastor and going deeper into passages that we don't normally have the opportunity to otherwise. And so, yeah, it's so huge to be able to give people the ability to spend time with you. And there's a trust transfer there, and relationships are built whether you have ever met them in person or not. All right, well, I'd love to get into some of the technical production side of things for a little bit here. We talked about the logo a bit at the beginning, but I wanted to ask you a question in addition to that. So as we were saying, it's an orange background, so it really jumps off as you're scrolling through if you're looking at the charts. And in the middle, it has a book that it says 10-minute Bible talks on it, but it's representing the Bible, I'm sure. And with that, there's also this shadow that's cast, seemingly, and it almost makes it look like a conversation bubble as well with the way that that's laid out. Was that intentional?
Yeah.
Okay.
We wanted, again, something that would immediately communicate the idea verbally, so 10-minute Bible talks, but then the logo captures it visually because it looks like a Bible, but it also looks like a conversation bubble. So Bible talks, I know it's not rocket science, but our goal was to be clear with people about what our purpose was so that they weren't going to be confused when they clicked on it. And that's been one of my favorite things is hearing from listeners who, I mean, by and large, people are finding us via, especially Spotify, but via the search functions. They're literally just getting on there and typing in words. So that's another thing we did. If you look at our title, now Apple will ding you for this, so I didn't tell you to do this. You just got to be careful. You're not supposed to keyword load your titles with Apple. So, for example, if your podcast is called 10-minute Bible Talks, you're not supposed to put in parentheses next to it, devotional, Bible study, and all the things you think people will search for to find you, because Apple's convinced they'll help people find you anyway, but their search functionality is terrible and they're wrong. And so if you can creatively include words in your title that you think will be more searchable, which is what we did. So technically the name of our podcast is 10-minute Bible Talks, Devotional Bible Studies. Now, I knew it was going to get away because it sounds like it could be the full title if that's what you wanted to call it. But the reason we did it is because I knew people were going to search for devotionals and I knew people were going to search for Bible studies. And I wanted to make sure that if they were doing that we were going to pop up on their thing. Unfortunately, the reality is if you go look at Bible studies and devotionals, there's some great podcasts. There are a lot of really bad podcasts. And some of the top podcasts are health, wealth, prosperity stuff. And so, people are like, well, why do you care? I'm like, that's why I care, because I don't want this person to go listen to Joel Osteen. I want this person to get the gospel, and they're going to be misled. And I can't tell you how many people who do not go to church. Many of them go to church now because we always encourage them. We have a whole newsletter, by the way, which is how we communicate with a lot of people. They found us that way. And so they just found the wrong thing. I don't know where they're at.
Yeah. So let's talk about the newsletter for a second, because as you were saying, there is a newsletter that goes out. It's a weekly newsletter on Wednesdays, a companion to the podcast. At what point did you decide to start a newsletter?
You're going to discover something about us. We're very grassrootsy here. As people come along and ideas bubble up, we do everything we can, if it's a good idea and the right person, to make it happen.
Yeah.
And so we have another staff member here. Her name's Annalyn Frazier.
Yeah.
She's a fantastic thinker, a fantastic writer, great Bible scholar. She had the idea to give herself a lot more work and said, hey, we should do a newsletter around 10-minute Bible talks, but let's let it go one step deeper than what you guys do. So maybe we'll do word studies in there. But she said, I want to keep a light tone with it too, so that people are having fun as they're reading it. So we based on some other newsletters that we'd seen that actually weren't Christian newsletters. And so she started going at it, and the content was fantastic. We're like, this is amazing. And more people started signing up for it. But when people sign up for the newsletter, the first email they'll get in response says, thank you so much. Tell us about yourself. How did you hear about us? What are you doing? And that's how we hear people's stories. They'll respond. I mean, tons of people respond. And, sometimes just, I found it in a search, but sometimes they'll respond and they'll say, I'm a single mom. I just went through a divorce. My husband left me. I don't know how I'm going to pay for my bills. I don't know how to buy, food. And I just needed encouragement. And that's why I searched for a devotional. And this podcast gave me life. And I heard there's a newsletter. I was like, I need more of this. So I got it. And I love those stories. I love hearing them. And I will say this, like, we believe in, unreasonable hospitality. And so when we hear those stories from listeners, we don't just sit on our hands. Like, we will call those, and we have a lot of listeners. We will call those people. We will pray with those people. If we can help them, like that mom, we sent them a gift card to Walmart to help pay for food. We do everything we can when we hear these stories to be personally engaged with our listeners. Because again, our goal here is not to make anybody's name big who's on the podcast. I'm guessing most people listen to it can't even say what our names are, and that is totally fine. What we really, really want is to care for people and see this podcast as an avenue for both helping them grow in their faith, but deepen their love for Jesus and for the church.
Yeah, that's a great point too, that with the newsletter, then you have a personal connection with people, because the podcast is just, if they want to listen to it, they listen to it. But then you create a way for people to reply, to have a little back and forth, and that's huge. So how have you seen the newsletter be of value in a different way? You talked about it a little bit, but then the podcast, or like, how do they play together? What's been the benefit, and why do you continue to do it that way?
Yeah, we have a number of things that are motivating us. One very sincerely was what you already said. Podcasts are one-way conversations, and we have no way of reaching the people who are listening to our podcast except for through their podcast RSS feed. In other words, you have no direct form of communication. It's up to them whether or not they listen to the episode. It's up to them whether or not they download it. Email isn't that way. When you have someone's email address, you are suddenly able to communicate with them directly. Now, of course, they can ignore your email. They don't have to pay attention to it, but it's very different to get an email on your phone than it is to get a podcast download update, if you even get that, which my guess is most people aren't actually getting that at all. And so that's been a huge value for us, is that it gives us a way to directly communicate with our listeners, to get their information so that, we have an idea of who they are and who's listening, so that we can actually calibrate the podcast to be helpful to them. Having a newsletter for all those technical reasons is great. At the end of the day, it has to be really good content that helps people. And that was our drive. Again, remember, we said we want this podcast for people who are kind of at the top of the funnel. They're learning how to read the Bible. And we envision the newsletter as kind of a next step deeper, peeling back the onion a little bit. We're like, oh, I've never heard of a word study before. What's that? Well, my gosh. The Old Testament's written in Hebrew. I didn't know that. What's this Hebrew word? Like, it's so easy to take for granted that, every Christian knows X, Y, Z. And the truth is that they really don't. Again, we try to be very evangelistic. We're trying to reach people who are far from God. And so we expect that all of this is new. If you want to find a book in the Bible, you're probably using the table of contents. And if that's you, we're the right podcast for you, and we want to be there. And I think the newsletter is helping those people just take another step deeper in their faith.
Yeah, that's huge. And as you were talking about that as well, when you sign up for the newsletter, because I just did this recently, there's also an optional questionnaire that you can fill out with some more information to get a better idea of who's listening to the podcast, who's engaging. How has that been instrumental in steering the way that you talk about certain things, or what books of the Bible you go through? How has that informed how you do the podcast?
Well, it probably hasn't informed what books we're going through, since we've kind of hit this phase where we're going through big chunks, but outside of that, I think the way it affects you is when you're aware of the stories of the people who are listening, you're going to be more cautious and caring and loving with your language, right? So if I know that there's a single mom who just got abandoned by her husband, who barely has any food, I'm going to be thoughtful when I'm going through a passage about divorce, or I'm on a passage about a single
Mm,
woman who has, like, I'm realizing that person is probably listening to this right now.
yeah.
And how I speak about this passage is going to be heard by them as how I think about them and how they're hearing it. But moving beyond that, I think it expands your applications, right? I know, for example, that there's a lot of parents listen to our podcast with their teenagers. And so that awareness for me means that I will sometimes include illustrations that talk about in applications, how do you apply this when you're at school, with your friends or in a class? And I might not have done that otherwise because, your default mode when it comes to application is almost always talking to people who are just like you because you're
Sure.
applying
Yeah.
it to
Yeah.
yourself. And,
Yeah.
and there's no, ego behind that. That's just what we all naturally do. And so being aware of the diversity of our listeners just gives us a little bit of freedom to realize I'm not the person listening to this and I need to make sure this actually connects with them in their life.
Yeah. That's great. So now that you've been doing the podcast for about 5 years, what makes it still worth doing at this point? That now you're almost through the whole Bible and you're hearing these stories. What makes you excited to keep recording these episodes?
Oh, man. Yeah. I mean, on the one hand, I hope I'm not the only one. Doing a podcast can be a bit of a grind. I think any podcaster will tell you that's the truth. But for most people, they got into it because they love communicating. They probably love writing and speaking, and they take great joy in it. And then they love whatever it is that they're talking about. If you can put those two things together, then you've got someone made for a podcast. And that's what I feel. I love the Bible. I love teaching the Bible, and I love communicating, and I love writing, and I love putting ideas both onto paper and then, out into the world through speech. And so, there's this great story from Chariots of Fire, very famous story about an Olympic athlete, Eric Liddell, and he's describing the reason why he runs. And he says, when I run, I feel the pleasure of God. And I think too often, we think God only feels pleasure in us, or that we only feel pleasure in God when we're doing quote unquote spiritual things like praying or reading our Bible or being in worship. But I think in an ideal world, our vocations, our callings, our work, those are the places where God does want us to enjoy him. And there will be times when we're doing things, you enter that flow state, that moment where it's like, oh my gosh, I'm losing time because I'm taking so much joy in what I'm doing, to realize it's not the thing itself that's giving you joy. It's the one who gives joy behind the thing. And so, I think for people who love podcasting, there is a joy, when I'm podcasting, I do feel like I feel the pleasure of God. Time goes by faster. I feel bad for, our producers and other people who have to sit in the room and listen to me talk because it's probably going by a little bit more slowly for them. But for me, I mean, I'm doing great.
Yeah, that's cool to hear. And yeah, great perspective. All right, I'd love to get into the high pass segment now, which is where we ignore the lows and I ask you about some of your favorite things. So first one, so you are in the St. Louis area, correct?
We're in Columbia, which is very
You're in
close
Columbia,
to St.
okay.
Louis. Yes.
So you're in the Columbia area. And so I'd love to know, what is your favorite restaurant that's there in the Columbia area?
My favorite restaurant in Columbia. I'm a foodie, so you're asking a dangerous guy right now. So I think I'm going to say two restaurants. Those are very different. I think if you're coming to Columbia and you don't want like a sit down, tabletop experience, you have to go to Bud's Texas style barbecue. I will say, I think it's the best barbecue in the state of Missouri. And Kansas City, which is where I grew up, is very famous for barbecue.
Yeah.
They can't touch what Bud's does. And I'm not saying that because I'm some sort of towny guy. He makes spectacular barbecue. But if you want a sit-down restaurant, you got to go to Kampai. It's a fantastic sushi restaurant. They fly in fish fresh from the coast. And so if you like nigiri or sashimi, it's a place to go.
Nice. Cool. All right. What's your favorite book or passage of the Bible that you've podcasted through?
Oh, man. That's actually a really hard question to answer. I mean, this will sound silly. I brought it up multiple times, but I actually really did love the section we did through Leviticus.
Yeah.
It was just a unique challenge. And I had a professor in seminary who wrote a commentary on Leviticus. So I think that spiked an interest in me at a younger age. And it was funny because, some of my co-hosts, they were like, oh, this is the worst thing ever. I'm like, guys, this is great. I mean, this is fun. We got to be real creative here. I mean, this is great. So I think that would be my answer.
Nice. Okay. What's one of your favorite stories from a listener about how 10-Minute Bible Talks has impacted their life?
There was a college student who was in her final year, trying to find a job, not having great luck, was entering I think a pretty deep depressive state. Felt like life didn't have a purpose, didn't know why she was here. She wasn't a Christian. She wasn't attending a church, but something in her just said, I've got to figure something out because like going in the direction I'm going right now is not working for me. And somehow she found our podcast, searching for it online, and she started listening. And not only did this lead to her eventually becoming a Christian and finding a church and a community of people to be in, but part of her difficulties were related to the fact that her dad was going through cancer at the time and was probably going to die. And so she gave the podcast to her dad, and it made a huge impact on her dad's life. And he ended up surviving. And I remember they sent us a picture of the two of them. And like that for me was like one of the most moving stories of, hey, it wasn't us. Like God's word has the power to breathe life into people. It happened in her life and it happened in his life. And I'm just so grateful that God, saw fit to use us as his tool in that family.
Yeah, that's fantastic. All right. What's one of your favorite ministry podcasts to listen to, or a favorite ministry that you wish had a podcast?
A favorite ministry podcast to listen to. As a Christian podcaster, I find I don't listen to a lot of Christian podcasts. I think it's because you make
you
so
do the
much.
Thing. Yep.
I have several that I do. I like podcasts that are honestly probably a bit more on the controversial side, make me think differently. So like you guys like Preston Sprinkle, I find super fascinating and interesting. His podcast, Theology in the Raw, because he always makes me think, I'm like, oh man, this is so interesting. I mean, he's a brilliant man and thinker himself. And he has just on the most strange guests. And so that for me is a lot of fun. I mean, honestly, my favorite podcast is probably not a Christian podcast. It's Barry Weiss's podcast, Common Sense. But there's so many good podcasts out there.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, how would you, as we close, how would you encourage ministry leaders who are just getting started in podcasting or facing some of those challenges to start a podcast like you faced back at the beginning?
I would say, number one, like just start small. You don't have to do one podcast every week. You can start with one podcast every other week. Figure out what that frequency is. Start small. Start with a test. You don't have to create anything. You don't have to make any logos, anything like that. Just start with a test, send it out to some people. And if you get good feedback on it, then you can feel a little bit more confident to take your next step forward. And if you can just keep taking that next right step, I think you'll find your way to making something great that really helps and encourages people. I have way too many streams of content, but I have a website called endeavorwithus.com. And on that website, we do have some stuff where we talk about how to start a parish podcast. And so, if people ever want to check that out, endeavorwithus.com, you can literally search at the top, parish podcast. And we've got a step-by-step guide walking through some of this. So that could be a great next step. Just, okay, I just need someone to guide me through the process. I'm sure you have great stuff like that too. And so anyways, just take the next step. Don't think about the whole thing. Next step.
That's great advice. And yeah, I'll be sure to link that in the show notes so that people can go check it out. Patrick, thank you so much for taking the time today to be on the podcast, share your journey, and get to, just share about how the podcast has impacted so many other lives and how it's been a great part of the ministry that you're doing.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's great talking with you guys. And I'm so encouraged there's a podcast like this out here to help ministry leaders, maybe get something off the ground that you might not do otherwise.
I really enjoyed my conversation with Patrick, and I hope you were encouraged by his podcasting journey. It was great to hear what goes on behind the scenes to make a daily podcast and how it's developed into that current format over several years. You can listen to 10-minute Bible Talks with the link in the show notes. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Ministries That Podcast, produced by Sonomorphic. If you enjoyed today's episode, follow or subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend. I mean, that's the best way to get the word out so together we can help more ministries grow and thrive through podcasting. Now come back in 2 weeks to hear my conversation with Jeff Brown. He's the host of Read to Lead podcast, as well as a mentor, author, and speaker. Jeff and I are going to talk about his 11-year journey in podcasting, how he's had to adapt to the ever-changing and growing podcast industry, his monetization strategy with multiple revenue streams, and the essential tools he uses to produce his podcast. Well, until next time, keep encouraging your audience as they follow Jesus.